The cold night air filled the streets as James Carter walked down the sidewalk, his footsteps steady and unhurried. The streetlights above flickered softly, casting long shadows on the pavement. The distant hum of traffic mixed with the occasional sound of a car passing by. It was a quiet evening, just like any other. James adjusted the strap of his briefcase, shifting it slightly in his hand. He had just finished an important meeting and was heading home. He was dressed sharply, his navy blue suit perfectly tailored, his black leather shoes polished and clean. His expression was calm, focused. It had been a long day, but he was satisfied with how things had gone. As he turned the corner onto a less crowded street, a sudden noise broke the silence, a sharp screech of tires. Then the blaring sound of a police siren. James slowed his steps and turned his head slightly. A black and white police car pulled up fast, stopping just a few feet away from him. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark street in rapid pulses of color. Before James could react, two police officers jumped out. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward. His uniform was neat, his badge gleaming under the streetlights. His name tag read Officer Bradley. His partner, Officer Miller, had a tense expression, his hand resting on his holster. "Hey, stop right there." Bradley's voice was sharp, commanding. James stopped, his brow furrowed in confusion. His grip on the briefcase tightened slightly. He had done nothing wrong, yet something in the way the officers approached made his heartbeat quicken. "Is there a problem, officers?" His voice was calm but firm. The officers exchanged a glance before Bradley spoke again. "We got a report about a robbery nearby. The suspect matches your description." James blinked. "A robbery?" He let out a small breath, shaking his head. "That's a mistake. I just left a meeting and was heading home." Miller took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Where were you an hour ago?" James kept his posture straight. "At the Grand Hotel, Conference Room B. You can check with the staff." Bradley crossed his arms. "Got any proof?" James exhaled, reaching toward his pocket. "I have my phone. I can show you my emails." "Don't move." Miller's voice turned sharp, his hand tightening around his holster. James froze. His hands remained still in the air. A tension filled the space between them, thick and heavy. A few people on the sidewalk slowed their steps, watching the scene unfold. "I'm just getting my phone," James said, his voice careful, controlled. Bradley didn't respond. Instead, he moved forward in one swift motion, grabbing James' arm. Before James could react, he was pushed roughly against the police car. The cold metal pressed against his chest. The snap of handcuffs followed. James took a deep breath, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His briefcase slipped from his hand, landing on the ground with a soft thud. The silver locks gleamed under the streetlights. "Officers, please," he said, his voice still calm despite the situation. "You're making a mistake." "Yeah, we'll see about that," Bradley muttered, tightening the cuffs around James' wrists. The murmurs of onlookers grew louder. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Some shook their heads. Others whispered among themselves. A woman nearby, wearing a red coat, stepped forward slightly. "He didn't do anything," she said, her voice uncertain but concerned. Bradley shot her a glance. "Step back, Mom. This is police business." Miller opened the back door of the squad car. "Get in." James closed his eyes for a brief moment before exhaling slowly. Without resistance, he stepped into the car. The door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed in his ears. The world outside the car seemed distant now. The flashing lights, the murmurs of the crowd, the cold night air, all of it felt far away. James sat still, his hands resting in his lap, the metal cuffs digging into his wrists. He had been in difficult situations before. He had faced challenges, obstacles, but something about this moment felt different. Outside, Bradley picked up the briefcase and gave it a glance before tossing it onto the front seat. Miller got into the driver's seat, adjusting the rearview mirror to glance at James. "Let's take him in," he muttered. Bradley nodded, closing his door with a thud. The car engine rumbled to life, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb. The streetlights outside blurred as they moved through the city. James remained quiet, his mind steady. He had nothing to fear. He knew the truth, but he also knew that sometimes the truth wasn't enough. The officers didn't know who he was. Not yet. But soon they would, and when they did, everything would change. The police car moved through the streets of Chicago, its red and blue lights reflecting on the buildings as it passed. Inside the back seat, James Carter sat still, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The leather seats were cold, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. The city outside blurred past him, but his mind was sharp, focused. He wasn't thinking about the arrest. He wasn't thinking about the cold steel around his wrists. He was thinking about what would happen next. Officer Bradley sat in the front passenger seat, typing something into the police database on the dashboard screen. His partner, Officer Miller, kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. Neither of them spoke. James shifted slightly, his wrists aching from the tight cuffs. "How long until we reach the station?" he asked, his voice calm. Bradley glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but didn't respond. James sighed softly. "I hope you realize your mistake soon." Miller scoffed. "We'll see about that." The car turned a corner, passing a row of streetlights. The city was alive with movement. People walking, cars honking, neon signs flickering. It was a world James knew well, a world he had worked hard to succeed in. But tonight, he was not a respected man in that world. Tonight, he was just a suspect in the eyes of these officers. The police station came into view, a large, gray building with high windows and a metal fence. The car pulled into the parking lot, stopping near the entrance. Miller and Bradley stepped out first. The back door opened, and Miller reached in, grabbing James by the arm. "Let's go," he said. James didn't resist. He stepped out, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Inside, the station was filled with noise. Phones ringing, officers talking, footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. The air smelled of old paper and coffee. Bradley led James through the main hall, past desks cluttered with files and computer screens. Some officers glanced at him, others ignored him. They reached a small processing room. A large desk sat in the center with a computer, a phone, and a few scattered papers. A metal bench was fixed against the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above. Miller motioned for James to sit on the bench. "Stay there," he said. James sat, his hands still cuffed behind him. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the details. He had been in police stations before, not as a suspect, but as a visitor, as a speaker. He had met officers, shaken hands with captains, spoken about improving community relations. But tonight, no one recognized him. Bradley sat at the desk, typing on the computer. The screen glowed in the dimly lit room. He entered James' name into the system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen loaded, and lines of text appeared. Bradley's fingers froze over the keyboard. His eyes widened slightly. He leaned in closer, reading the information in front of him. Miller noticed his reaction. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. Bradley didn't answer immediately. His throat felt dry. Slowly, he turned his head toward James, who sat calmly on the bench, watching him. Miller frowned and leaned over to look at the screen himself. His eyes scanned the words, and his breath caught in his throat. Dr. James Carter, neurosurgeon, Harvard graduate, CEO of the Carter Foundation, philanthropist, award-winning doctor. The words stared back at them, solid and undeniable. Miller's face paled. This can't be right," he muttered. Bradley leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. He had expected to see something else. A record, a history of trouble. anything that would justify their actions. But instead, they had arrested a man who was the complete opposite of what they assumed. Silence filled the room. Neither officer spoke. James, still sitting, let the moment stretch before finally breaking the silence. "Well," he said, his voice steady, "are you starting to realize your mistake?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you say who you were?" James raised an eyebrow. "Would you have believed me?" Miller had no answer. He glanced at Bradley, who looked just as uneasy. Bradley cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "We were following a report. A man matching your description." James let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Matching my description. And what description was that?" Neither officer answered. James sighed and leaned back against the wall. "You know," he said, "I've spent years working with communities, funding education programs, helping hospitals. I've worked with law enforcement too. But no matter how much I do, no matter how much I achieve, I still get treated like this." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miller looked at the floor. James shook his head. "You assumed the worst about me without knowing anything. But now that you know who I am, you're questioning yourselves." Bradley cleared his throat. "Dr. Carter, we." James cut him off. "Untie me." Bradley hesitated. Miller glanced at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, finally, Bradley reached into his pocket and pulled out the key. He stood, walked over, and unlocked the cuffs. James exhaled as the metal was removed from his wrists. He rubbed the sore skin but said nothing. The room was still silent. Bradley stepped back, not meeting James' eyes. James looked at both of them. "What now?" he asked. Bradley swallowed. We made a mistake." James studied him for a moment. Then, slowly, he stood up. He adjusted his suit jacket, picked up his briefcase from the floor, and took a deep breath. He looked at the officers one last time. "A mistake," he repeated. "I hope you remember that." With that, he turned and walked toward the door. Bradley and Miller watched him go, neither saying a word. The sound of his footsteps faded as he disappeared down the hall. But the weight of what had just happened remained, heavy and unshakable. The night air was colder than before as James Carter stepped out of the police station. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. A few streetlights flickered along the sidewalk, casting long shadows on the empty street. James took a slow breath, the fresh air filling his lungs. His wrists still ached from the tight cuffs, but he ignored the pain. He was free now, but the weight of the night still pressed on him. A black car was parked across the street. The engine was running, and the headlights glowed softly in the darkness. The driver, a tall man in a gray suit, stepped out as soon as he saw James. He walked toward him with quick steps, his face tense with concern. "Dr. Carter, are you all right?" the man asked. James nodded. "I'm fine, Michael." Michael Davis, his personal assistant and longtime friend, exhaled in relief. "When I got the call, I could hardly believe it. They actually arrested you." James let out a small sigh. "Yes." Michael shook his head, his jaw tight with frustration. "This is unbelievable. Do they even know who you are? What you do for this city?" James gave a small, tired smile. "They do now." Michael glanced back at the police station, his eyes filled with quiet anger. "They should be ashamed." James didn't respond. He had already said what he needed to say inside. The officers knew their mistake. He could see it in their faces. That was enough for now. Michael opened the car door. "Come on. Let's get you home." James slid into the back seat, sinking into the soft leather. As the car pulled away, he rested his head against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. The events of the night replayed in his mind. The flashing lights, the rough hands grabbing him, the cold metal of the handcuffs, the doubt in their voices. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. The car moved smoothly through the streets of Chicago, past tall buildings and quiet alleys. Inside, the silence stretched until Michael spoke again. "Do you want me to call someone? The press? A lawyer?" James shook his head, opening his eyes. "No, not yet." Michael frowned. "This shouldn't just be forgotten, James. What they did to you, it was wrong." James turned his head slightly, looking out of the window as the city lights passed by. "I know," he said softly, "but I also know how this works. If I go public with this, it becomes a bigger story than it needs to be. Right now, I just want to think." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but if you change your mind, just say the word." James gave a small nod. He appreciated Michael's loyalty, but right now, he needed time to process everything. The car finally pulled into the driveway of James' home, a large, modern house with wide glass windows and a peaceful garden. The lights inside were dim, the house quiet. James stepped out, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. Michael followed him to the door. "Get some rest," Michael said. "And if you need anything, call me." James placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." Michael gave a small smile before turning back to the car. James watched as his friend drove away, the taillights disappearing into the distance. He let out a slow breath and stepped inside his home. The warmth of the house wrapped around him, but it did little to ease the thoughts racing in his mind. He walked into his study, turning on a small lamp. The soft glow illuminated the room, highlighting the shelves lined with books, the awards on the wall, and the framed photographs of his achievements. He sat down at his desk, running a hand over his face. Then he reached for his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he started typing. He wasn't sure if he would send this email, but he needed to get his thoughts out. To Captain Reynolds. Subject: a conversation we need to have. Captain Reynolds was the head of the police department, a man James had met a few times at community events. He was someone who claimed to believe in justice. James' fingers moved across the keyboard, the words coming naturally. "Tonight, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. No evidence, no proper questioning. Just an assumption based on how I looked and where I was. This is not just about me. This is about every person who has been judged unfairly. We need to talk." He stared at the words for a long moment before hitting send. Leaning back in his chair, he closed his eyes. This wasn't over yet. The morning light filtered through the large windows of James Carter's study, casting soft golden streaks on the wooden floor. He had barely slept. His mind had been too restless, playing the events of the previous night over and over again. The email he had sent to Captain Reynolds still sat in his outbox, marked as sent, but not yet responded to. James wasn't sure if the captain would reply at all. Maybe he would ignore it. Maybe he would read it and do nothing. But maybe, just maybe, he would take it seriously. A sharp knock at the door pulled James from his thoughts. He turned toward the sound, rubbing his tired eyes. Another knock followed, louder this time. James pushed back his chair and stood up, stretching his sore shoulders. He walked to the door and opened it. Michael stood outside, his face set in a firm expression. But behind that, James could see concern in his friend's eyes. "I know you said you didn't want to make this public," Michael said, stepping inside. "But we have a problem." James closed the door behind him. "What happened?" Michael pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times before holding it up. "It's already out." James took the phone, his eyes narrowing as he read the news headline. "Respected Surgeon Dr. James Carter wrongfully arrested. Another case of racial profiling." He scrolled down, seeing a blurry image of himself in handcuffs, being led into the police station. His jaw tightened. The photo must have been taken by someone passing by. The article went into detail about his achievements, his work in hospitals, and his role as a philanthropist. The comments were already flooding in. Some people were outraged. Others were defending the officers. James sighed and handed the phone back. "This was never about making headlines, Michael," he said. Michael frowned. "I know. But now that it's out, you need to respond. People are talking about it." James sat down on the couch, running a hand over his face. "What am I supposed to say?" Michael took a seat across from him. "Tell them the truth. Tell them how it felt. Tell them what needs to change." James looked at his friend for a long moment. He knew Michael was right, but deep down, he was tired of having to explain himself, tired of having to prove that he belonged. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. James Carter. A familiar voice came through the line. "Dr. Carter, this is Captain Reynolds." James straightened slightly. "Captain." There was a short silence on the other end. Then Reynolds spoke again. "I received your email." James waited, his fingers gripping the phone a little tighter. Reynolds cleared his throat. "I want to meet. Today." James exchanged a glance with Michael, who raised an eyebrow. "I'll be at my office in an hour," James said. "I'll be there," Reynolds replied. The call ended. Michael leaned forward. "Well, that was fast." James set the phone down. "Let's see if he's actually ready to listen." An hour later, James sat in his office, waiting. His office was neat, the shelves lined with books, awards, and medical journals. The large window behind his desk overlooked the city, the tall buildings stretching toward the sky. A knock came at the door, and before James could respond, it opened. Captain Reynolds stepped inside. He was a tall man in his early 50s with graying hair and a strong presence. He wore a dark suit, his badge pinned to his belt. James gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." Reynolds nodded and sat down, his expression unreadable. He folded his hands on the desk, looking at James for a moment before speaking. "I want to start by saying that what happened shouldn't have happened," Reynolds said. His voice was steady, but James could hear the tension beneath it. "I've reviewed the reports. Officers Miller and Bradley made a mistake." James leaned back in his chair. "And what happens now?" Reynolds exhaled. "They will be disciplined. They will undergo additional training on racial bias and proper protocol." James studied him. "That's it." Reynolds frowned slightly. "Dr. Carter, I understand your frustration." James shook his head. "No, Captain, you don't." He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "This wasn't just about me. This happens every day to people who don't have the same resources or platform that I do. And most of the time, no one listens to them." Reynolds was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right." James watched him carefully. He hadn't expected Reynolds to admit that so easily. Reynolds continued, "I can't change the past, but I want to do something about the future. I want to work with you, Dr. Carter." James raised an eyebrow. "Work with me how?" Reynolds sat up straighter. "I want to set up a program. A partnership between the department and the Carter Foundation. Training, community engagement, real conversations between officers and the people they serve. I need your help to make it happen." James didn't respond immediately. He hadn't expected this. He had expected excuses, defensiveness. Not this. He looked down at his hands for a moment, thinking. Then he met Reynolds' gaze again. "I don't want this to just be about appearances. If we do this, it has to mean something." Reynolds nodded. "Agreed." James studied him for a long moment before finally extending his hand. Reynolds took it, shaking firmly. "Let's do this right," James said. Reynolds gave a small, approving nod. "We will." As the captain stood and walked toward the door, James felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. This was about something bigger. And now maybe something good could come from it. James Carter stood at the window of his office, looking out at the city. The streets below were busy with cars and people, moving as if nothing had changed. But something inside James had shifted. The meeting with Captain Reynolds had ended with a handshake, but James knew that promises meant nothing without action. Words could be empty. He had seen it before. People said they wanted change, but when the time came, nothing happened. Would this time be different? His phone buzzed on the desk behind him. He turned and picked it up. It was Michael. "James, you need to see this," Michael said, his voice urgent. James frowned. "See what?" "Turn on the news." James grabbed the remote and turned on the television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing a news reporter standing outside a police station. In a shocking turn of events, new body cam footage from the night of Dr. James Carter's arrest has been leaked, the reporter said. The video, which is now spreading rapidly online, reveals the full conversation between Dr. Carter and the arresting officers. And what it shows is disturbing. James' grip tightened on the remote. The screen changed, showing the body cam footage. The image was slightly shaky, taken from the perspective of one of the officers. James watched as the events played out again. In walking down the street, the police stopping him, their harsh voices questioning him without cause. Then came the moment that hadn't been reported before. One of the officers, Officer Bradley, could be heard whispering something to his partner. The words were quiet, but clear enough to be heard. "I don't care who he is. Just get the cuffs on." The video froze. The news anchor appeared again, her face serious. This new footage raises even more questions about the incident and whether this was a case of racial profiling. The police department has yet to release an official statement, but public outrage is growing. James exhaled slowly. He had already known the truth, but hearing it so clearly, it was different. His phone buzzed again. It was Michael. "You still there?" James nodded, even though Michael couldn't see him. "Yeah, I saw it." "This changes everything," Michael said. "People aren't just talking about your case anymore. They're demanding answers." James ran a hand over his face. "And what about Captain Reynolds? Has he said anything?" Michael sighed. "Not yet, but he won't be able to stay silent for long." James lowered the phone and thought for a moment. He had spent his life working to help people, saving lives in hospitals, giving back to his community. He had never wanted to be in the middle of something like this. But now he had no choice. He took a deep breath. "Call a press conference." Michael paused. "Are you sure?" "Yes," James said firmly. "If the truth is out, then I need to speak." 2 hours later, James stood in front of a podium, cameras flashing around him. Reporters filled the small conference room, microphones pointed in his direction. He took a breath, then spoke. "When I was arrested that night, I already knew why," he said, his voice steady. "It wasn't because I had done something wrong. It was because of an assumption based on the way I look." The room was silent, everyone listening. The footage that was released today shows what many people in this country have known for a long time. James continued, "That sometimes it doesn't matter who you are or what you've accomplished. You can still be treated as less than. And that needs to change." A reporter raised her hand. "Dr. Carter, do you believe the police department is responsible for racial profiling?" James looked at her. "I believe that this problem is bigger than just one police department. This is about a system that has allowed these assumptions to exist for too long." Another reporter spoke up. "Captain Reynolds promised to work with you on a program to prevent situations like this. After seeing the new footage, do you still trust him to follow through?" James paused. He knew this was an important moment. He couldn't just say what people wanted to hear. He had to be honest. "I spoke with Captain Reynolds before this footage was released," he said. "At that time, he told me he wanted change. Now, we'll see if he truly meant it." The press conference continued, more questions coming, more flashes from cameras. James answered them carefully, making sure his words carried weight. By the time it ended, his phone was already buzzing with calls and messages. One message stood out. It was from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Captain Reynolds." That evening, James met Reynolds at a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. The captain looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. He didn't waste time. "I saw the footage." James nodded. "And?" Reynolds let out a slow breath. "It's bad. Worse than I expected." James studied him. "Are you still willing to fix this?" Reynolds met his gaze. "I don't have a choice." James shook his head. "No, you do. You could walk away. A lot of people in your position would." Reynolds was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I don't want to be one of those people." James sat back in his chair. "Then let's make this happen." They talked for over an hour, going over real steps, real plans, not just promises, but actions. James wasn't interested in empty words. As he left the cafe that night, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, something was about to change. James Carter sat in the back seat of the car, watching the city pass by through the window. The streets looked the same as they always did. Cars rushing by, people walking along sidewalks, going about their daily lives. But for James, everything felt different. His phone vibrated in his hand, and he glanced down at the screen. Another message, another email, another request for an interview. Ever since the bodycam footage had been released, the world seemed to be watching him. Some people called him a hero. Others called him a troublemaker. He wasn't sure which one was true. Maybe neither. Maybe both. The car slowed as it approached the community center. James could already see the crowd gathered outside. Reporters, cameras, community leaders, police officers. It seemed like the entire city had come to see what would happen next. Michael sat beside him, tapping on his phone. "The press is all over this," he muttered. "Social media is blowing up. People are calling this a turning point." James exhaled slowly. "We'll see." The driver pulled to a stop, and James stepped out of the car. The noise hit him immediately. Voices talking, cameras clicking, people calling his name. He kept his face calm as he walked up the steps of the center. Inside, the room was already full. Rows of chairs were set up facing a stage where a long table was placed. Several city officials sat behind it, including Captain Reynolds. James took his seat. A microphone sat in front of him, waiting. The mayor, a tall woman with sharp eyes, tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "We are here today because a situation took place that never should have happened. And we are here because we must ask ourselves what comes next." She looked at James. "Dr. Carter." James leaned forward, his hands clasped together. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. He cleared his throat. "I never wanted to be sitting here," he said simply. "I never wanted to be the face of this conversation. But now that I am, I won't stay silent." The room was quiet. People listened. "This isn't just about what happened to me," James continued. "This is about something much bigger. We can't keep pretending that these things don't happen. We can't keep looking away. We need real change." A reporter raised his hand. "Dr. Carter, do you believe this new program with the police department will be enough?" James glanced at Reynolds, who sat still, his face serious. Then he looked back at the reporter. "No, it won't be enough," James said. "But it's a start, and if we don't start somewhere, we'll never get anywhere." Reynolds finally spoke. His voice was calm, but firm. "We know that trust between law enforcement and the community is broken. We are here today to begin the work of rebuilding that trust. We are not here to defend what happened. We are here to make sure it doesn't happen again." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people nodded. Others still looked skeptical. James understood. Trust wasn't built in a day. Words weren't enough. Now, it was about action. Over the next few weeks, the program started to take shape. Community meetings were held. Training sessions began at the police department. Officers sat down with people from neighborhoods they had never spoken to before, listening to their stories, hearing their concerns. James attended every meeting he could. He watched as officers struggled to admit their biases. He watched as community members challenged them, sometimes with anger, sometimes with pain. It wasn't easy. Change never was. One evening, James walked into a meeting at the community center. He took a seat in the back, listening as people shared their experiences. An older woman stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she held a piece of paper. "My son was arrested last year for nothing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like Dr. Carter." But no one listened to him. James felt a knot form in his chest. The woman looked at Reynolds, who sat across the room. "What do you have to say to the mothers like me?" she asked. "The ones who never got justice." The room was silent. Everyone waited for Reynolds to answer. The captain took a deep breath. "I won't stand here and make excuses," he said. "I can't change the past. But I can promise that we are trying to change the future." The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and sat down. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Months passed. The news cycle moved on, but the work continued. One afternoon, James walked through the hospital, his white coat draped over his shoulders. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to just be a doctor again, to be in a place where he knew exactly what to do. As he reached the waiting area, a man stood up from one of the chairs. He looked familiar. James paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he realized, Officer Miller, one of the men who had arrested him that night. Miller looked nervous, shifting on his feet. "Dr. Carter," he said hesitantly. James studied him. "What are you doing here?" Miller swallowed hard. "My wife is in labor," he said. "They told me you were the doctor on call." James held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. "Come with me." He led Miller down the hallway toward the delivery room. As they walked, Miller cleared his throat. He hesitated. "I never apologized." James didn't say anything. Miller exhaled. "I didn't see it that night, but I see it now, and I'm sorry." James stopped outside the door to the delivery room and looked at Miller. For the first time, he didn't see just a uniform. He saw a man who had made mistakes. "Be a better man for your child," James said simply. Miller nodded. James pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to do what he had always done: save lives. James Carter stood outside the hospital, breathing in the cool evening air. The sky had turned a deep shade of blue, and the city lights flickered in the distance. It had been a long day, one of many long days in the past few months. The hospital doors slid open behind him, and he turned to see Officer Miller stepping out. His face looked different now. Less tense, more human. "It's a boy," Miller said, a small smile on his lips. "Healthy. My wife is doing fine too." James nodded. "That's good to hear." Miller shifted on his feet, as if trying to find the right words. "Dr. Carter." He hesitated. "I know we'll never be friends. I don't expect that. But I just want you to know, I've been thinking a lot. About what happened. About everything you said." James didn't respond right away. He studied Miller's face, looking for something: honesty, regret, maybe even hope. Miller let out a slow breath. "I can't change what I did that night," he said, "but I can be better. I want to be better." For a long moment, James said nothing. Then, finally, he nodded. "Then start now." Miller gave a small nod back. Then he turned and walked into the parking lot, disappearing into the night. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Some things changed, some didn't, but at least now there was movement. At least now there was a chance. The months that followed were a test of patience. Change never came easily, and not everyone welcomed it. Some officers resisted the training sessions. Some community members refused to trust the police, even with the new program in place. James understood. Wounds didn't heal overnight. But there were moments, small moments, that showed progress. A young officer choosing to listen instead of assume. A community member shaking hands with a police captain after years of distrust. The meetings continued. The conversations continued. Some were hard. Some were hopeful. One afternoon, James sat in a conference room across from Captain Reynolds. Papers were spread out between them. Plans, reports, next steps. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "You really think we're making a difference?" James looked at him. "I think we're trying." Reynolds sighed. "I never thought I'd be working side by side with you like this." James allowed a small smile. "Neither did I." Reynolds smirked. "Guess life is full of surprises." James nodded. "Yeah, it is." 1 year later, the city had not transformed overnight. There were still problems. There were still challenges. But there was also something else. Progress. The new training program had become permanent. Officers were required to go through bias training. Community outreach programs had grown stronger. And James, he had gone back to his first love, medicine. One afternoon, he stood in the hospital, reviewing patient files when his phone buzzed. He glanced down and saw a text from Michael. "Turn on the news." James grabbed the remote and switched on the TV in the break room. A reporter appeared on the screen, standing outside a police station. "In a historic decision, the city has passed new policies aimed at preventing racial profiling and ensuring greater accountability in law enforcement. This decision comes after months of discussions and training led by both community leaders and police officials, including Dr. James Carter and Captain Reynolds." James stared at the screen, his chest tightening. It had happened. He had spent so much time fighting, so much time pushing for change. And now, it was real. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "We did it. Captain Reynolds." James let out a slow breath. They had started something that mattered. And it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.